Video games have been capturing our imaginations for decades, growing from simple little games into massive immersive worlds. It's wild to think that one of the first video games, Tennis for Two, was made way back in 1958, long before video games was even a common term. This basic tennis simulator helped start an entire industry, but there is one thing missing that's pretty much a staple in games today: music. Imagine if Tennis for Two had a catchy little tune playing while you hit the ball back and forth. Maybe it would have left even more of an impression. In this video, we're going to dive into how music can truly make or break a video game experience, and we're zeroing in on one specific type of music: the battle theme. I'll be comparing the battle themes from two games, Final Fantasy VII and the newer Metaphor Refantazio. We'll look at the similarities, the differences, and maybe see if Metaphor's composer, Shoji Meguro, picked up any inspiration from Nobuo Uematsu's work on Final Fantasy VII. Personally, I think a game's battle music has to be one of its best tracks, especially in turn-based RPGs like Final Fantasy or Metaphor, where you're running into battles constantly. That music has to be something you actually want to hear over and over. It should make you excited to take on enemies and feel unstoppable. Right now, we're listening to Final Fantasy VII's battle theme, Those Who Fight. Let's break down why this music works so well, and why it gets players pumped up for every fight. Here's my transcription of the core elements of the track, the parts that really define its sound. Of course, there's more going on, but I think this version captures the heart of the theme. I've broken it down into 5 tracks: lead, lead 2, support, support 2, and bass. The lead tracks carry the melody, while the support tracks fill in the harmonies, and the bass provides the crucial foundation. I think it's really interesting how games from the PlayStation 1 and just older games in general had to be made. Composers were working with compressed samples triggered by MIDI data. Think of it like digital sheet music for the PS1 sound chip, telling it exactly when to play a sample, how loud it should be, how long to hold it, and so on. This was a really creative solution to help save space in the disc by not using full audio tracks. Even with those limitations, composers like Nobuo Uematsu created unforgettable tracks. In this piece, you can hear compressed samples of strings, percussion, brass, and synths all combining to give it a unique and unmistakable character. Let's take a listen to the full song, and then we'll break it down. Right from the start, this piece establishes a strong sense of forward movement. It keeps players feeling like they need to stay sharp, constantly on edge. One of the key factors behind that urgency is the underlying rhythm, found most prominently in the lead after the intro. The rhythm here features a dotted quarter note pattern that creates a syncopation. Essentially, the accents don't align with the downbeats. They land on the upbeats or the and of the beat. If you tap your foot to the beat, the melody's rhythm often lines up with the moments when your foot isn't touching the floor. This syncopation creates a sense of unpredictability. When I hear this rhythm, it gives me the sense that I'm moving, running, or doing whatever I have to do in order to avoid danger and deal some serious damage to the enemy. The rhythm being syncopated makes you feel like anything can happen, and you need to be ready for whatever comes your way. That being said, let's focus in on the bass part. This bass part lays a solid foundation of eighth notes accented on the 1, the and of 2, and the 4 of the first measure of this pattern, and the and of 1, the 3, and the 4 of the second measure. The accented notes highlight that driving syncopated rhythm, but doesn't omit the non-syncopated notes. Despite being slightly harder to hear given its volume in the mix, this bass part creates a sense of stability for the player, telling them that, despite needing to stay sharp, that you are the one in control, and this is a situation that you can handle and are prepared for. Using an AI instrument isolator, we can raise the volume of the bass part in order to really understand what's happening here. The role of the bass part is so much more clear when the volume is raised, but I think if they had decided to make that bass part louder in the final mix, the piece wouldn't come off the same way. This stability provided by the bass should almost be more subconscious, and not so much of a part that the player is actively listening for. It's so interesting how slightly adjusting the levels of instruments in a mix can completely change how a piece of music is perceived. To really emphasize the importance of the bass part, let's take a listen to the song without the bass and see what that does to it. Suddenly, that foundation that the bass provided before is completely gone, leaving the player feeling unsure. The stable bass line, paired with the syncopation of the driving rhythm of the piece, is, in my opinion, what makes this piece such an effective battle theme. Metaphor just recently released, as of the recording of this video, on October 11th, 2024. Throughout my 100 hours playing the game, I couldn't shake this feeling that the game just felt so weirdly familiar. And not just because it's just Persona, but with fantasy and politics. A lot of the game reminded me of elements from games of the past. For example, Gallica the Fairy Guide reminds me a lot of Navi from Ocarina of Time. The game's main antagonist, Louise, gives me vibes of Seymour from Final Fantasy X. The dynamic between Grius and his daughter Maria reminds me so much of the relationship between Barrett and Marlene from Final Fantasy VII. In reference to the play Loveless from Final Fantasy VII, there is a candidate named Loveless. Also, I don't think that the name of the party's hideout, the Hushed Honeybee Inn, was named that by sheer coincidence, and was instead a direct reference to the Honeybee Inn from Final Fantasy VII. And of course, the reference to Majora's Mask is incredibly obvious. These are just a few similarities off the top of my head, and I could just keep naming them one after another.
One after another.
It honestly feels like the director of the game, Katsura Hashino, specifically told everyone on the Metaphor team to draw from RPGs of the past that took place in a fantasy world. And personally, I think it all comes together to work so well. And I see it as a celebration of the world of video games that came before it to culminate into what was ultimately created in Metaphor. It was a lot of fun playing this game and seeing all these references put in for those that grew up with video games in the 90s. But what I'm really fascinated by is the similarities in the music between Metaphor and Final Fantasy VII. Just like with Final Fantasy VII, let's take a look at the battle themes for Metaphor, discuss why they work as well as they do, and finally, see what exactly is so similar between these and the battle theme from Final Fantasy VII. Here is my transcription of some of the more prominent elements of Metaphor's normal battle theme, Warriors and Valor. This is the battle theme that plays when you manage to stun an enemy in the overworld, and then enter turn-based combat against them. This also plays when you choose to simply enter combat by pressing the corresponding button. Let's take a listen to it, and then we'll break it down. Throughout the entire song, the same dotted quarter-eighth rhythm from Those Who Fight is present in the bass. Alongside this, the strings, starting at measure 9, create a hemiola effect in order to make the listener feel the eighth notes in groups of 3 instead of 2. Because the violins are accented on the 1, the and of 2, and the 4 of the first measure, and the and of 1, the 3, and the 4 of the second measure, it helps line it up perfectly with the recurring bass rhythm. The piece then opens up at measure 29 with soaring trumpets and a triumphant choir to assure the player that they've got this in the bag. Another element that helps to make the player feel alert and ready to go is the tritone in the bass at measure 12, signaling the end of the section leading into where the chant begins. This is very similar to what the Final Fantasy battle theme does at measure 9, with a very similar purpose: to signal the beginning of the next section. In Those Who Fight, this interval isn't a tritone. Instead, it's a minor second, but it still achieves the same result. To support my point of a tritone and minor second serving similar purposes, we can look all the way back to the Middle Ages of Western music. In the Middle Ages, roughly between the years 500 and 1400, all the way until the end of the Renaissance period, roughly between the years 1400 and 1600, the tritone and the minor second were thought of as restless or even evil, especially to the church. So much so that these intervals were referred to as diabolus in musica, literally translated from Latin, the devil in music. And if you just listen to them, you can kind of see why it was thought of that way. It gives this sense of unease or discomfort. Shoji Meguro and Nobuo Uematsu took full advantage of this concept in order to create the sense of unease for each song's transition. To further demonstrate this point, let's take a look at Warriors in Arms, which is the music that plays when you get ambushed by an enemy in the overworld, forcing a turn-based encounter, with the player being at a disadvantage. Let's take a listen to it, and try to listen for where Shoji Meguro aggressively makes use of Diabolus in Musica, and notice how much tension it creates in the music. It's really interesting how the piece is so similar to the normal battle theme, but really instills the sense of anxiety in the player, almost as if to say, you really messed up, dude. What gives this piece that extra layer of tension is the Diabolus in Musica that I mentioned earlier. Right in the first measure, we have a flat 2 chord. A lot of times you'll see a flat 2 chord in first inversion as a means to progress to the 5 chord, and then finally ending at home, the 1 chord. And we would call this a Neapolitan chord. In this case, the purpose of the flat 2 is much different. First of all, it's in root position. Because it's in root position, the distance between the first chord of the song, the 1 chord, and the second chord of the song, the flat 2, is a minor second. In the first measure of the song, we already have Diabolus in Musica. The next instance is in measure 2, where we have an E-flat fully diminished 7th chord, which is extra tense, because a fully diminished chord has 2 tritones in the same chord, between E-flat and A, and G-flat and C. You might be thinking, okay, I can't get any more Diabolus in Musica from here, right? And you'd be wrong. Let's check out measure 5, which is where things get really interesting. Here we have low brass playing a short motif that goes B-flat to F to B natural. You might be thinking, so what? Yeah, there's a tritone in the F to B, but how is this any more evil than the fully diminished E-flat chord? And to that I would say this. If you look closer, you'll notice we have a double instance of diabolus in musica. Yes, we have the tritone between F and B, but we also have the distance of a half step from B-flat to B within that same melodic fragment. So in essence, we have both versions of diabolus in musica on the exact same beat of this measure. Between the E-flat fully diminished chord in measure 2 and the double diabolus in musica in measure 5 and onwards, I think this is the essence of what makes this song so much more uncomfortable. This helps convey to the player, not only do you need to be on your toes and fully alert, but there's an incredibly high chance that you might actually die here. There's absolutely no margin for error. Don't mess up. I started making this video because I noticed some interesting similarities between the battle themes of Final Fantasy VII and Metaphor. But then I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I started doing more research into other games' battle themes. This underlying driving rhythm is so common in video game battle themes that I started to have a difficult time finding one that didn't have this rhythm. It either directly had the dotted quarter-eighth rhythm featured prominently, usually in bass instruments or percussion, or that rhythm was at least implied by use of accented eighth notes.
Because of the implication.
Okay.
Very quickly, here are a few that I picked out. Here is a short snippet of the battle theme from Tales of Arise. While the driving rhythm in question isn't featured in the bass or percussion, which is instead providing a stable foundation, the rhythm is instead found in the melody. Next, let's take a look at Hornet's theme from Hollow Knight, composed by Christopher Larkin. The eighth notes of this piece are grouped up into groups of 2 or 3, creating a hemiola effect similar to Those Who Fight and Warriors in Valor. In 3/4, eighth notes are usually grouped up as simple groups of 2, but in order to demonstrate the rhythmic quality of the piece, we switch between grouping them in 3s and 2s. If you tried counting 1 and 2 and 3 and for the entire piece, it wouldn't feel right. Instead, if you counted 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2, it would more closely resemble the intention of the piece. That being said, the correct way to count this rhythm would still be 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and. But that doesn't stop the listener from feeling it in 3s and 2s. This concept is identical to Those Who Fight. Then, if we look to measure 14, we see the exact same dotted quarter-eighth rhythm that was featured in Those Who Fight, once again utilizing this battle theme trope that we've grown to unconsciously expect in battle themes. Now, let's peer into the future and take a look at what Christopher Larkin is doing in Hollow Knight Silksong. This piece is called Lace. This song uses this driving rhythm, but takes it to the next level. The only time our driving rhythm is found on the downbeat is on beat 1. For the remainder of the measure, it is syncopated, creating even more of a sense of having a hard time finding your balance. In Silksong, Hornet is going to be very acrobatic, and will spend a large portion of her time leaping through the air, especially during this fight against Lace, so it's fitting that our driving rhythm is taken up a notch to emphasize this element of gameplay. Christopher Larkin really knew how to take advantage of this musical concept in order to create this sense of unease that is found in many battle themes throughout the music industry. Overall, we've discovered that a good battle theme needs to have some key elements in order to keep the players engaged. The piece needs to have a strong sense of forward movement, and we found that a great way to achieve this is with that dotted quarter driving rhythm, or at least the implication of that rhythm through accented eighth notes. But most importantly, the song needs to be amazing, and the listener should want to listen to it over and over. As of the recording of this part of the video, I put nearly 140 hours into Metaphor, and I never once got tired of listening to that battle theme, which is a testament to the skill of Shoji Meguro. He very clearly took inspiration from games in the past, and I only see it as a positive because it helped him create some fantastic music for Atlus's latest project, and I'm so excited to see what he makes for games going forward, especially with Persona 6.